Hi, I'm Mindie Burgoyne, and this is Fridays in the Graveyard. I love a graveyard, don't you? Today I'm in Whitemarsh Cemetery in Trappe, Maryland in Talbot County. It's right on Route 50. You can see the highway and probably hear it right behind me. So if you've ever traveled to the beach, the Atlantic beaches down Route 50, you've passed by this all the time. Sometimes people call this the hole-in-the-wall cemetery. And why? Because there's a big wall with a hole in it that you can see behind me. The truth about that hole-in-the-wall tag, and I mean this place is mapped by Google as hole-in-the-wall cemetery, is that over that way behind me on the other side of the highway, if you go straight across on the road that comes out from this cemetery, you'll come to a crossroads with just 4 houses. That is formerly known as the village of Hamilton. And in Hamilton, many years ago, probably 100 to 200 years ago, there was a tavern named Hole in the Wall. And there's a tale associated with it. So the Hole in the Wall affiliation actually was for something over there. But because this is close by and there's a big hole in the wall, people call it Hole in the Wall Cemetery. It's an active cemetery. People here come to mourn and the burials are recent. So this part up here that's all fenced is the old part, the graveyard that was with the church. And I want to tell you, this is a mysterious place because when I was working on my first book, I came here to talk about the grave of Robert Morris. And Robert Morris is buried over there on that side of that wall. He was the father of the financier of the American Revolution. Robert Morris was probably our equivalent today of a real estate developer. Came from Liverpool, bought up some land for people over in England and developed it. When I went to tell the story of Robert Morris, I was talking, dictated into a recorder. This is how I took notes. So I picked my recorder up and I put it to my mouth and the wind kicked up and I couldn't record because wind drowns out your voice. So I put my recorder down, I waited a second, the wind died down, I picked it back up. As soon as I picked it back up, the wind kicked up again. So I dropped my hand and the wind stopped. And so I began to think, this is like a game, me and the wind. So I tested it. I waited a second. I waited until it was completely still. I lifted my recorder back up and the wind kicked up so powerfully that it nearly knocked me on the ground. I couldn't give the commentary about the Robert Morris grave here. And the whole time that wind was going, I could hear this little tiny tinkling, this ding, ding, I mean so slight. And I kept thinking, where is that coming from? So after I gave up on dictating it about Robert Morris, I started to walk towards the tinkling sound. And I found this little grave, a little tiny grave down the hill there, it's way down there. And it had a wind chime on it that was maybe 4 inches high, just hung on a little hook. And that was the tinkling sound. And I thought, oh, that really carried. Then I continued to walk around the graveyard to look at the graves, and it's quite a spot. Maybe about 5 acres here. Maybe not that much. There were wind chimes everywhere. Big ones, little ones, they were all over the graveyard. I couldn't help but wonder, why didn't I hear those? Why did I only hear the little one? So if you come up here by yourself and you start walking around, you'll begin to feel that sort of mystical feeling that is in this sacred ground. So that's Whitemarsh Cemetery. There's also a ghost story attached to this. And it has to do with Hannah and Daniel Maynadier. So Daniel Maynadier was the rector here. And he was here for about 30 years. He died in 1745, and he was here until his death. And his wife, Hannah, as the story goes, died at a young age. And grave robbing was a big deal then. And they went to bury her right here, right next to the church. And sure enough, as she was buried with her ring on. And as soon as the people left, the grave robbers came and they exhumed Hannah. They took her out of the grave. They opened the grave and quick went for that ring. But one grave robber says to the other one, I can't get the ring off. And he says, well, get out your knife and cut off her finger. Hurry it up. They're going to catch us. So the grave robber that was holding Hannah's hand pulled out her finger, pulled out his knife, and goes to cut. And as soon as he slices into her skin, Hannah rises up out of the coffin and she starts to scream. Of course, they thought that was the spirit of Hannah coming back in retaliation, so they took off. Poor Hannah's left there by herself, bleeding. She wraps her shroud around her, she climbs out of her grave, and she goes home to her grieving husband, who was waiting for her, nursed her back to health, and she eventually had many more children. And Hannah and Daniel are buried. You can see this little plaque in the floor right there behind me. That's their memorial, just over there in that corner. 1745 is when he died. Now there is an interesting aspect about this story. It's been told and told and told and told. It's one of the oldest folklore pieces on the Eastern Shore. I went to a ghost tour in Belfast one year, not too long ago. And we were in front of St. Anne's Episcopal Church. It's a great ghost tour, by the way. If you're ever in Belfast, take it. And the lady tells this story. She says, you know, the rector had a wife who died young, and she wanted to be buried with this ring on her finger. And she goes and tells the exact same story. I mean, right down to, and the woman picked up her shroud, gathered around her, walked home to her grieving husband, and he nursed her back to health, and she had many more children. It was exactly the same story. I even called the guy who runs that tour in Belfast and said, where did you get that story? Because we have the same story. And he said, we've always had that story. In Scotland last year, I went on a ghost tour in Edinburgh. They had the story too. So it appears that this being buried with your ring on and having the grave robbers come get it and cut your finger off and you wake up is like an urban legend, like the hitchhiker ghost story and the lady in white and Crybaby Bridge. I mean, everybody has one of those stories. So I began to think about that, and that story teaches us about just graveyard lore. Because about the time when this happened with Hannah in the mid-18th century and on up, people were very afraid of being buried alive. Medical technology wasn't as good as it is today, and they weren't always dead. Sometimes they were in a coma. And so people that had money would pay to have someone stand by their grave and wait. They would tie a string around the deceased's wrist and thread it out of the coffin and thread it up through the grave and tie it to a bell. And so if anything stirred in the coffin, it would tug on that bell and the bell would ring, and the person waiting by the grave to make sure that that didn't happen would quickly uncover the coffin and allow the person to come out. And that it was known as being saved by the bell. And yes, that's where that phrase came from, as did for whom the bell tolls, as did graveyard shift. That's the person who has to be there all night in the graveyard. So I guess there's so many accounts of that story because it's sort of a lesson about how people were buried alive and what the practices were of the day. Anyway, that's your graveyard trivia for this week. This is Mindie Burgoyne. This is Fridays in the Graveyard, and I'll see you next week.